Bonjour. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très content d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. On va parler de design systems. Levez votre main si vous avez déjà utilisé un système comme ça. Oh wow, I really wasn't expecting any French speakers, so thank you. You see, French is not a shared language among us today. If I was to, well, maybe just one or two. I've been learning French for about 5 years now, and little secret, I'm a deeply terrible French speaker. If I was to speak in French, my ability to communicate my ideas and my thoughts and concepts throughout the duration of this talk would be severely hampered. In order to really communicate an idea and be confident that I'm transmitting a shared thought that gets to you in the same shape that I've sent it, we need that shared language. It's important. So, where was I? The idea, the concept of shared language, shared understanding, and shared direction have played absolute central themes for me in my career. Ultimately, they've encouraged me to lean into what we call design systems, which I've seen dramatically change the way that teams work with one another, that they collaborate and communicate, both with each other and with their users. Today, I want to share my experience working with design systems and also show you some of the secret superpowers that I've experienced in the hope that I can encourage you to lean into. But before we get started, I need to really explain kind of how I got into this industry in the first place. And to do that, I need to take you back to the 90s. So I was about 8 years old. It was 1997, 1998, something like that. And we got the internet in our house for the very first time. Now, who remembers internet in the 90s? It was, it was the dial-up kind. We measured everything in kilobytes per second. That was the speed of the internet back then. And I reckon on a good day we had 22 of them. There wasn't an awful lot to do on the internet in those days. This was before Google. This was before Facebook and MySpace and everything that you can imagine. To be honest, I think it was also before we had mobile phones in wide use. But as a pretty creative kid, I had pretty creative friends. We would build skateboard ramps out of old bits of wood and build tree houses and make secret dens and secret clubs. And we took this same curiosity and fascination to the internet. Without a lot else to do, we decided that we were going to build our own worlds. And to do that, we had to be able to code on the web. We learned how to build websites. Now, granted, these websites weren't really going to amount to much. They were basically storage facilities for dancing baby GIFs and scrolling neon text and visitor counters and guest books. But they were meaningful to me. I kind of felt a little bit like a magician who had just learnt a new magic trick. And I knew the mechanisms and the secrets behind the trick, and nobody else did. This stuck with me. I found it to be a really profound time, and 15 years later, I started my career as a web developer. It didn't last very long. I started out with a few small software companies, and I helped them build web applications. But very quickly, I realized I was dissatisfied, and the experience that I had with personal projects of being able to be not only the engineer, but the designer and the architect was missing for me from the world of work. So I decided, even after paying for a uni degree, which everybody knows are exorbitantly expensive, I decided to pivot my entire career and instead focus on product design. And in the years that followed, I worked with businesses from the very small startups of the world to the super huge global enterprises scaling with product teams popping out of the woodwork here, there, and everywhere. And I helped them to build web applications, but design them too. Now, after I think this was kind of a couple of years into my career, I got a contract with Deloitte. And I said to my new manager, I said, hey, why did you hire me? Is it because I've got this nice creative edge? You think I'm a good designer, maybe? Did I stand out from the crowd? And she said, no, it's not that. However, it was something quite interesting. She said, I hired you because of this, the intersect between you being a designer and you being an engineer. Now, that became particularly important in my career, that ability to design, to intertranslate design intent into engineering and back again. And I think really, There's a few reasons for this, but we, as product developers and product development teams, we have a few goals in mind. The first one really is that we want to deliver experiences that are robust and extensible. We want to deliver value to our customers, and we want to be able to help our businesses move forward towards our goals. But as product development teams, we have a lot of problems that we put in our way. There are a myriad of problems that we need to solve as product development teams as we kind of go through that forming, storming, and norming process that we have. I want to talk about two in particular that I think are fairly universal to, well, pretty much all of the product development teams I've worked with during my career. The first one is intra-discipline communication issues. The way of thinking about intra-discipline communication is, in a product development team, we have our designers, we might have UX, we might have visual, we've got our front-end engineers, we might have full-stack engineers, we've got product managers, QA specialists. If we're lucky, we've got UX writers or content strategists. And we all speak fundamentally very, very different languages. Has anybody ever been in that situation before where you've designed a beautiful user flow, it's this fantastic prototype, and what you get back from your engineering teams feels a little bit like a criminal artist's impression? Yeah, I think we've all been there. And this happens from the engineering side too, and it's deeply unsatisfying. The difficulty there is that you've got to take all of that thought you've got to go from a 1,000-foot view where you're looking at the end-to-end user flow down to a 10-foot view where you're studying the micro interactions of an input control or a button. And it's really challenging to get all of those ideas across to your engineering team. But intra-discipline communication actually goes both ways. Think of it like this. So our engineers can build pretty much anything. Given enough time and money and resources, they'll build anything that we want them to. But as designers, we need to be able to give them the optimal solution. We've got to be able to tell them what we want them to build. To do that effectively as designers, we need to understand all of the different opportunities that underlying technology affords us. But all of that lives in the mind of the engineers. And so it becomes a communication challenge for our engineers to be able to transmit all of that expertise and domain knowledge across to our designers. The one thing that crops up for me all the time is kind of the cost of design. As a designer, we might have multiple opportunities in front of us, and we've got to pick one that we feel is most optimal. How can we understand the cost of that design? Maybe it's quite cheap to produce now, but it's going to slow us down in the future. Or maybe this is the best solution, and it's going to take us a little bit longer, but it's the right thing to do. The second challenge is inter-team communication. Communication between different product development teams. And this is something that I see these challenges creep in for businesses that are scaling or really large distributed businesses across the world where we have multiple product development teams. The challenge here is in keeping people aligned and facing in the same direction, and also finding opportunities for these product development teams to sync with one another and collaborate when common solutions are possible. Why do we have challenges with inter-team communication? Well, it's usually because of context. There was a really great study, I think it was a couple of years ago now, by somebody called Gerald Weinberg, and it looks at context switching in humans, and it goes a bit like this. So if you give me one task, I can devote 100% of my attention to that task. But the second you give me two tasks, I'm going to lose 20% of my overall attention to switching between them. If you give me three, I'm going to lose a further 20%. That's 40% of my entire energy devoted to just kind of moving between these three tasks you've given me. And by the time I have four, I'm going to lose 60%. The majority of my attention span is going to be lost to moving between all the different tasks that I'm trying to focus on. And this is the challenge for product development teams. That's the rub. A, we want them to focus so that they can get their work done efficiently and focus on what's important. But B, we also want them to lift their head above the parapet and connect with other teams when there's opportunities for collaboration. The net effect of both this challenge and this challenge is that we miss opportunities for alignment, we have missed opportunities for moving our product forward, and ultimately we end up with miscommunications as well. These lead to product debt and design debt and technical debt. Product fragmentation, our user experience gets worse, and because we're dealing with more debt, our teams get slower and slower. So, if we can find a solution for speaking the same language to solve intra-discipline communication, and if we can find a way to establish a North Star to help teams align, and maybe even a team that helps them understand when these collaboration opportunities are present, then maybe we can begin to work better as a network of product development teams. And that is exactly what the promise is of design systems. So, what is a design system? I think everyone will be familiar with some of these. You've got Carbon's IBM, Twitter Bootstrap, arguably one of the early ones. I think, has anybody used Twitter Bootstrap before to either design or build experiences? Yeah, quite a lot of folks. And Material by Google. What do we remember about these design systems? Well, for me, Bootstrap, I always remember the little UI components. I remember like the buttons and the simplicity of them and how they pop up on every single website. And for Google Material Design, I remember that kind of pop fill, you know, the animation as you kind of like lift off one of those yeah. And if we do a bit of a search on Google for, you know, a definition of a design system, we see things like this. I realized this morning that this is an InVision quote, so we might have to scrub that. But what is a design system? It's a collection of UI components bound together by principles. Now, that's all right, it's fine. It's a bit unsatisfying. I think oftentimes we define design systems by what they look like. And as I mentioned with these before, we remember them by the different components in them, what they look like. But really, I think this is just scratching the surface. There's far more that we can do to explain what design systems can offer us. And so today, I don't want to tell you about what design systems look like, but I want to tell you about what they do. So, the definition for me is something like this. A design system offers us a shared language that connects all the people in our product development ecosystem and gives them the tools to work with each other and work with our users. Ultimately, it allows them to create user experiences, ecosystems that are not just good user experiences, but they are meaningful, they are familiar, and they are connected. I think the reason that defining design systems is so challenging is because there is not a perfect recipe for creating a design system. We pick the different component parts depending on what problems we want to solve in our businesses. And this is a really common graphic. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen this in the past, but it shows you that it's not really just about components and patterns. It's actually about content strategy, or maybe it's about brand guidelines. I mean, you can see up there in the top left corner, we've got dev standards that speaks to the idea that design systems aren't really just about design. There's many different component parts. Now, while there isn't a single recipe for design systems, I do think there are three macro kind of ingredients or nutrients, and they are people, they are tools, and language. So, in 2017, I joined a business called Anaplan. I just found out this morning that they've been acquired, which is pretty awesome. And they're a San Francisco-based tech firm. If you haven't heard of them, they help businesses around the world to gather business data from all angles of a business, see patterns in that data, and then use that to optimize business performance. Now, when I joined, there were a team of 500, and they were in a hyper-growth space. And over the course of the 4 years that I worked with them, they grew to a team of over 2,500. On day one, I sat down and my boss said to me, "Hey, Mark, we're about to kick off a brand new program of work and we're going to reimagine the entire end-to-end user experience of our platform. The .com site, the help site, the learning portal, and the application itself," which was massive. To do that, they needed a design system. And so over the 4 years that followed, I not only built out that design system, but I built out the core team that supported it. A diverse team of designers, engineers, and content strategists. We saw 4 key superpowers in that time, and they're what I want to talk to you about. The first superpower was harmony. Some of these are a little bit superhero-y, so bear with me on this. But the first one was harmony. Design systems are great at driving harmony in our end-to-end user experience. They help us to smooth out the peaks and the troughs of our end-to-end ecosystem. Why is that important, though? Well, as designers, we're not really designing one-off single-page solutions anymore. Instead, what we're doing is we're designing user flows that take place over multiple contexts, probably multiple pages or areas of our applications, and potentially they're going to be developed by multiple product development teams. In order to really kind of hit the user right, we need these to be familiar and cohesive and seamless so that we're not exposing our users to the underlying problems of the way that we've organized our business or our teams. We want them to see an entirely flat plane as if it's been designed and built by a single team. And the way that design systems support us in doing this is through design languages. This is the design language we built at Anaplan, a really highly ordered language that allows us to make sense of the user experiences we're creating. So at the top, you might recognize components, patterns, and experiences. I think we see these in all of our design systems. And I could describe these as the atoms, the molecules, and the organisms of the world if we were to go by like a Brad Frost analogy, but I'm going to avoid doing that today. Instead, I'm going to think about them as if it were a proper language, like French, where the components are the words of our language. And when we pull these components together, we can create phrases. And when we pull these phrases together, we can create chapters of a book written in the language that we're designing. I think the interesting bit is at the very bottom of this language, where we've got grammar. Our principles are really the fundamental laws of physics, the building blocks of our language, the grammar and the mechanics. And at Anaplan, we laid out principles for usability, accessibility, visual design, internationalization, content, technical robustness. They gave us a few things. The first thing they did is they helped us, they're opinionated thought pieces, essentially. And the first thing they did is allow us to explain why we'd taken certain decisions in our design language. But the cool thing is they also helped us predict how the design language was going to evolve next. So when we had a team come to us and say, we need this new component or this new pattern, or we're seeing this new stimulus that we need to react to, our principles helped us really understand how that language might react and grow to support that use case. Built directly on top of our grammar are our letters, which we can piece together to make our words. For us, our letters, the foundations of the language, looks at things like color, elevation, shape, space, iconography, and typography. And I've got typography here to show you. Foundations are kind of the unsung heroes of a design system. They are so flexible and so incredibly powerful. They give us the first piece of shared language certainly between our designers and our engineers, with these simple variable names. Instead of saying hashtag 3C670A for our brand blue color, we can say brand blue, or for us it was Blue Mariner, which I think I might say on the next slide. But they also give us something else. If you think about typography, if we're creating a typographic scale, we're never just thinking about the size of that font. We're also thinking about the weight, the color, letter spacing, line height, the weights. We were able to use our foundations to consolidate all of this information and give it a single word, which for us was banana. We created what's called the fruit scale. So what we wanted to do is not only create a shared language between design and engineering, but we also wanted to give people a helping hand on actually using it and remembering it. And the fruit scale was the perfect way to do this because, everybody knows fruit. If I give you a blueberry and a watermelon, I'm pretty sure everyone in this room can tell me that the blueberry is vastly smaller than the watermelon. So it allowed us to do this relative sizing, even if you weren't familiar with the scale. Over time, we used our foundations to build components, and you can see here the foundations that are listed underneath. Our components were patched together to make those patterns, and ultimately, we made those patterns into full-page experiences and flows. Very quickly, we saw our entire ecosystem begin to harmonize. These two screenshots were taken from the opposite ends of our platform, one of them by a team in the UK, the other by a team over in San Francisco. They had nothing to do with one another. Their capabilities did not overlap, and yet the experience, if you came out of one of these areas and dropped into another, began to feel cohesive. The next kind of superpower that we saw is speed, but before I jump onto that, I want to talk about this inventory experience. It's the one that you can see on the back, the graphic at the back. This was a simple experience for managing lists of objects within our platform. It allowed you to do sorting and filtering and pagination and all those bits and pieces. We saw that 2 teams were trying to build a similar thing. And so the design system brought these teams together and we created a common solution. When we shipped that, 7 teams, I think this was in the first month, 7 teams lifted this solution and built new experiences in the platform using it. One of the teams came back to me and said, hey, do you know how much time we saved by leveraging this instead of rebuilding it ourselves? I can't do the percentage in my head. I think it's like 8.1%, but they did it in 1/12 of the time, in one sprint when they'd actually quoted 12, which was amazing. So that was the second superpower we saw, speed. Now, there was a bit of a challenge quite early on in our design system. We realized that teams, a lot of our designers and engineers and product managers as well hadn't leveraged design systems in the past. They didn't really know how to work with us. And we had a lot of issues around adoption and engagement. Is anybody here trying to build a design system at the moment? Anyone? Oh gosh, yeah, so there's lots. Keep your hands up if you've got adoption issues. Same people, yeah, I think we all face this. We realized that what we had to do was take the design system to our consumers rather than expecting them to come to us. So we built out tools for our designers to help them leverage the system. We built out a real fully fledged sketch kit, but we went one step further. We built this kind of inspect functionality, so a designer in Sketch could select one of the components that they'd leverage from our system, and the usage guidelines would populate on the right-hand side in a panel right within the Sketch environment. We also did this for the engineers. You can see that over on the left-hand side. We created this awesome React API. And instead of creating reams of documentation to complement that, instead we built it in a language called TypeScript, a framework, TypeScript, which basically allows us to take some of those guidelines and materials and directly input them into the code editor that the engineers were using, so they could explore the language as they were using it to build. And this dramatically changed essentially the adoption of our system. Very quickly, we saw teams leveraging this at a greater level of adoption, and ultimately, this helped us drive speed. We weren't redesigning the same components anymore, or the same patterns. We weren't rebuilding them. We weren't retesting them. And so that helped us move much quicker as a business. When I'm talking about speed, though, I'm not really just talking about speed in isolation. I'm talking about it in regards to this triangle. And if you haven't seen this before, this is how it works. So you can only optimize 2 sides of the triangle at once. If I want to deliver a solution fast, and it's a broad solution, it's got a really wide scope, then it's going to be a low quality solution. But if I want to deliver a super high quality solution with the same scope, a broad scope, it's going to take me a little while to do it, and speed's going to drop off. Design systems, because they focus on reuse and evolution rather than rebuilding, we had that engineering component to this that allowed us to do that. We could really break this triangle. So we could make sure that we were delivering fast solutions at high quality and enabling the teams to achieve the scope that they were looking for. Telepathy. The third superpower was telepathy. Terrible name, but you follow me on this one. So we've already created this idea of a shared language, right? But what we realized we weren't doing is really getting our designers and engineers to speak the same language. Ultimately, the design system was like a Rosetta Stone and just allowed them to have this reference point. And we had problems like this. So take the button on the left, I'm pushing down on that button. And our engineers would call this active, but our designers would call this pressed. But the one in the middle, our designers would refer to as active. Our engineers would call that pressed. It's in a Boolean on or off state. And we also had challenges over focus and hover. And what we realized is everyone was using very different words to describe the same behavior. And this was incredibly problematic when we were designing and building new additions to that design system. At this point, we decided that actually what we could do is leverage that React API we'd built. That's just what we did. So when we built and shipped the React API, we did so through Storybook. Has anybody used Storybook before? Yeah, fab, awesome. If you haven't used it, it's a really, really great tool for interacting with live built components in their abstract form. So you can select a button or an input field and use it as if it was actually inside an application. It's also a really great space for us to highlight the API around that particular component. So what we did, because we had all of our engineers there in the first place, is we encouraged our designers to move into that space by mandating certain properties on the API. So we were a little bit sneaky about this. So if you look at so we've got a nice kind of switcher there, and on the left-hand side, you've got a bunch of different props that we can pass to the component. We began to mandate and require each of those props if they were important. And by doing that, if the designer hadn't included that information on their spec, the engineer could force a conversation, because in order to get the component working, they needed a setting for this. And we found this to be incredibly beneficial. Over time, our designers would spend more and more time in Storybook. They would learn the vocabulary that our engineers were speaking in. And finally, we were able to speak in one voice. The final superpower we saw is influence. So about 3 years into building this design system, we'd achieved a really great level of maturity. We had adoption across the entire business. All of our different solutions across the ecosystem were leveraging this central design system. And this afforded us a brand new opportunity. At about the same time, the business were looking to push forward with some holistic strategies around accessibility and internationalization and customization of the platform. I think this is pretty typical for enterprise teams to kind of want to be able to do this, but when you have a huge ecosystem, it's really challenging to be able to deploy an entire solution like that. Like, how do you make an entire ecosystem more accessible without having to get every single designer and every single engineer to rework all of their solutions? Because our design system was connected, it was much easier for us to at least support that conversation and drive it forward. So going back to that design language architecture that we set up, we created principles that describe the business's approach to accessibility, because we knew that the first thing we had to do was break the educational barrier. We had to inform our teams what our perspective and opinion were and how we were going to help them to drive accessibility forward in our products. Next, we looked at the foundations. Now, I mentioned foundations were great for shortcuts, and they helped us really accelerate product development. And there was another opportunity for us here. We realized that actually, as a data viz platform, a lot of our considerations around accessibility were actually around color contrast and legibility of both text and charts. And by doing just a little bit of work in our foundations and rolling that out to the ecosystem through our connected engineering offering, we were actually able to ensure that designers couldn't pick two colors that would provide an insufficient contrast. On the text side, because we were providing things like banana, these were wrapped text styles and text settings. They would just include them on the engineering side, and all of our new variables, all of our new values would pull through. So we could ensure that, actually they're going to pass for accessibility, certainly in terms of things like the line height and the color contrast. The final piece of the puzzle was to help people when they're leveraging our components and patterns in the system. And we were able to do that, again, through our React API. Because we were delivering black box components that neither our designers or engineers got to see into, we could very easily update those components, ensure that they were passing in isolation for AA compliance, which was kind of our benchmark, and provide the right props to ensure that designers and engineers could have a pointed and specific conversation about what information needed to be included. And this was really dramatic. Within 6 months, we saw the overall accessibility of the platform lift significantly. And we saw that first with the work that we'd done in our foundations. So, to wrap up, there you have it. These are the 4 superpowers of design systems, certainly as I've seen them: harmony, telepathy, speed, and influence. I can't talk about superpowers without talking about Kryptonite. There is one fundamental piece of Kryptonite in design systems, and this is really where you can all lean in. It's investment, or a lack of investment. Ultimately, design systems aren't projects with start and finish dates on them. They're really part of our critical infrastructure A little bit like how our servers are. Like if you turn the servers off, our application goes down. If you switch our design system off, what happens to our user experience? But we don't just need investment from our senior leadership teams. It's not just purely financial. Design systems, I think I've learned more than anything, are about building communities of people involved in creating really great user experiences. And this is where you can all absolutely lean in. It needs support and investment from folks who are using that system on a day-to-day basis. It needs your experience, it needs your guidance, and it needs your expertise. So I've leaned into design systems because, for me, they help me to work better with engineers and help product teams to deliver better products at scale. And I would encourage you all to lean in too. Thank you.
Do you want to have a seat? Well done.
Thank you.
Helps off to water.
Oh, fabulous.
You hadn't really done public speaking like many people for the last 2 years, have you?
2 years.
How was that?
That was all right.
It was good.
It's okay when you get into the swing of it. It's fine.
Before we start getting into nitty-gritty, who's your favourite superhero?
Oh, that's a terrible question.
One, isn't it? I know. I'm a tough
For me,
interviewer.
Right now, Black Widow.
Wow.
All the way. Scarlett Johansson.
That's left field.
Yeah.
Didn't see that coming. Anyway, lots to cover there. That was absolutely fascinating. You and I were talking before, and I was fascinated to hear when you started to have the passion to do what you're doing, and you said that you wanted to be an engineer, you wanted to build things, but then there was a disconnect. Just tell me about that, because I want to look a bit into the education stuff. So you come out of university. I'm old enough to have my fees paid by the government, by the way, at university. I must be the only ones here who doesn't have a student debt. So you had that disconnect. Just tell me a wee bit about that, to explore that. So you wanted to build things, you did this degree, you got out into the big bad world, and you were a bit disillusioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the challenge that I had was in university, for me anyway, when I was going through it, it was I wasn't doing a web development degree. I was doing a computer science degree. It was incredibly academic.
Yeah.
And the folks who I was working with, they were geniuses. Geniuses? They were.
I think both.
They were genii. And
very clever.
Yeah, very, very clever people. I was not. I was not this person. And I always had this creative edge that nobody else seemed to have. And anyway, when I moved into the world of work, I didn't see a continuation of that. It was much more diluted than that. But what I saw is people who were really fantastic engineers, and they were specialists. And I realized that I wasn't a specialist, and I was struggling to kind of keep up in some ways. It took me a long time to realize that actually I kind of was a specialist, but I was specialized in being a generalist, which is a really weird way to think about it. I was somebody who was more interested in not just the engineering in isolation, but the thought process that took us from an idea to a concept to a design through to a build. And so I realized that actually it's okay to sit on the fence between these two worlds and operate in that way.
It's interesting because the next talk actually fits very well into that, in defense of a jack of all trades, which I think probably fits with that. So therefore, and it might be a common theme here, I don't know, does there need to be a look at education at that level rather than when you get to organisations and into the business world? Do you think there's things that could be changed within the education system that might make that easier?
I think these changes have already happened.
Okay.
I mean, we're going back a long time now since I completed my degree, and it has changed tremendously. At the time, you couldn't do a degree that looked at UX design. It just, they weren't out there. And now what I see, especially when I'm hiring folks who are just starting out their careers, they're brand new to the industry, they often come out of these boot camps, and the boot camps look at not only design, but the engineering side of it too. Often as well, research, product management, they're so broad, and these people have such a fascinating grasp of the industry from day one, which I only hope to have been able to do.
So that's improved then, you think? Yes.
Massively so, yes.
Well, that's good news. And in terms of, I'm interested to hear everyone's kind of experience of the pandemic and how, and everyone, we've got shared, everyone has been through it very differently and will have had to adapt differently. How has it impacted on your life and what you do and what you create and what you build the last 2 years? What's different?
Yeah, it's a lot has changed.
Where do you start?
Where do you start, right? Yeah, so I'm, as you might be able to tell, I'm a people person. I'm a connector, and the idea of being shut in a 2 by 2 meter box room felt a little bit like a prison cell. And it took a long time for me to adapt, but I think I think the thing that I found most profound is that the style of communication has changed. We've obviously had to, everyone's moved on to Zoom and Teams and whatever you use, but I think our focus has had to be on like, okay, how do I become a better communicator? Because I'm not there in real life in order to be able to share my experiences and my ideas. And, you know, we sit down at a table together and circle our ideas, and we don't have that kind of tactility to
it became more one-dimensional, didn't it, in a lot of ways?
It absolutely did,
How did you get round that? How did you get round that?
I think we're still learning to get around that. We're leaning more on tools. So everyone will know with InVision, it's a collaborative tool, and we've certainly changed the way that we think about the industry, about how teams work together. And so we've had to really lean on those tools and get the most out of them to ensure that actually those relationships we've got are valuable.
So there's been some positives come out of it then,
Yeah.
would you say?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's allowed us to really kind of focus on our communication styles and methods. I think generally we're all probably better communicators than we were even a few years ago, because we've had limited resources to support us in doing that. Certainly not face-to-face interaction.
Just going back to some of your talk, just to sort of summarise some things, what would you say from your experience are some of the biggest challenges in improving digital communication from what you've come across, with some actual examples that you've come across?
Yeah. That language piece is massive. And I don't know if teams ever get to the point where everyone is really truly speaking the same language, but I know that getting teams to bond with one another and find partners in crime in different discipline areas is absolutely key to be able to kind of moving forward as a team and working together better. Oftentimes now what I kind of try and encourage is, I know I'm kind of talking about design and engineering, but there are many more disciplines involved in the product development lifecycle. What I try to encourage now is actually, you know, if we bring in a new designer into the business or a new engineering, we find that kind of link. We give somebody a partner who's in a different discipline area, and it just helps build that kind of trust and communication across the board.
How much is that down to a company culture then, the organisational culture? And is there much, you know, in terms of advice, how do you think you can change that for the better?
Yeah, it's massively down to company culture. I think sometimes the way that we kind of construct our organisations is that we have very high walls between our different groups, product, design, engineering. We often talk about them being kind of legs of a stool, and then there's insights as well, where do research fit in. I think from a cultural point of view, businesses can do a lot to really kind of bring down those walls and ensure that, you know, it's not necessarily engineering's responsible for this and product and design are responsible for these things, but actually we need to come together as a team. And in InVision, we call this the trio, the EPDI trio, or the quadruple.
Yeah.
And we make sure that, you know, whatever decisions that we're taking as a business, we have alignment and agreement from all of those discipline groups. And I think that reflex just helps us to make well-rounded decisions. And it helps acknowledge that, okay, while we do speak different languages, we really want to make sure we're getting everybody's point of view.
Have you noticed in any shape or form slightly more cautiousness among investors because of the pandemic? Has that changed at all, do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I think what I've certainly seen is certainly working with collaborative tools. Both the businesses that I've worked with throughout the pandemic have been focused on collaborative tooling. And there's been an upsurge in business for us, obviously. I mean, you know, we're having to rely and lean on these tools much more. And it gives the tools an opportunity to really kind of evolve and grow. So I think there's been advantages for business, certainly in the tech industry, but it has meant that we had to really change the way that we not only operate, but think about the world of work.
And it's interesting because, as I say, you know, I'm by no means massively tech savvy, but I've followed it with interest because during the pandemic, tech has developed so incredibly quickly. I know we're talking about, we've got a talk around about the COVID app that was developed, and you had the Zoe app that, I don't know if anyone was inputting into that. They got the most incredible qualitative details about COVID. How do you think tech's responded during the pandemic to things like that? Has there been positives? Has there been downsides as well, do you think?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure really. I think obviously we like I say, on that communication side of things, like we have developed the way that we think about the world.
Yeah.
The negative side is kind of looking at work-life balance.
Yeah.
Now we're all working at home. Work has the potential to become much more invasive in life. I don't know about anybody else. Who's in the box room doing work at the moment? Anyone?
We have a
folks.
fabulous talk on that coming up, I think. How many people here, just out of interest, are working from home just now?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. So I work in a quite different industry, so we've been in right from the start in broadcasting, but I think I'm slightly more unusual, probably.
Probably.
We're going to hear some very positive stuff about working home from our Canadian friends soon. In terms of investment, we're talking about that. You were saying that investors are looking for a beginning and an end. How do you convince them otherwise, and what you have as a product is worth that investment? So how do you, is that a mindset change? Because I know investors will look for almost a binary, boom, boom, there's what you've got.
Yeah, I think so.
That's an obstacle, isn't it?
It is an obstacle, yes. I think for us it's about, ultimately this comes down to how good your research reflex is.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that we're really connected with our users and our customers and understanding exactly what challenges they're facing in their business, because that allows us to tweak our roadmap and direction to really make sure that we are not only competitive, but really answering the needs of our users. And I think that reflects, certainly as we move into this new world where, you know, we might be hybrid, we probably won't all go back in the same way that we worked in before, for better or worse. We have to
Do you think that's changed now, that's it, the culture has moved on and it will be different now? It won't go back to what it was.
Yeah, I think it's definitely evolved. I think for a little while there was this binary question of do we go back or not?
Yeah.
And it's much more nuanced
Black and
now.
white, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like how much do we go back into the office and how much can we do remote? I certainly miss things like travel. I miss seeing people in person, but you know, that's the negative side of it. But the positive side is I have focus in my day and I can shut everything out and just concentrate on my work. But I think back to what you were talking about, you know, how do we stay relevant? I think it's really about listening, because nobody can predict what's going to happen next. We're still, this is new to all of us. We've never been through this before.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is about just understanding, like, okay, what do our users need right now? What can we solve today to help us move forward? And just taking a real long-term view on where this is likely to go.
Well, if you could conjure up your crystal ball, as it were, then, what do you think the trends will be? What do you see going forward for the digital world? What are going to be the main themes?
Yeah, I think for me it's about hybrid work. It's people in the office and people at home, and finding collaborative mechanisms to help both parties knit together. I mean, if you've ever been on a Zoom call in an office where, you know, you've got lots and lots of people on that call working from home, and you're sat there with 5 other people in the office and you can't hear a word that's going on, we've got a lot of kind of comms challenges still on that side.
Yeah.
I know for us, we used to spend all of our day around the whiteboard or around the coffee machine talking.
Yeah.
We've lost all of that, especially if you're kind of someone like me who predominantly does work at home now. And you've got to find opportunities in your technology, in your collaborative tooling to help enable that again. I think that's going to be a massive, massive trend.
Just out of interest, who here honestly enjoys working from home? That's that's interesting.
I kind of do.
And who hates it? Who doesn't like it? Let's not use hate. Who doesn't like it? Okay, sort of, fewer. Okay, interesting. I'm aware that there's probably a lot of people want to ask Mark questions. We do have roving mics actually, but if you want to, I mean, the acoustics are okay here. If you don't, I've got plenty more. Is there anyone who wants to fire a question to Mark? Yes, lady at the front. Would you like a mic? Can we bring you a mic? Would you take a mic?
Who doesn't want a mic?
Yeah, there you go. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you. The talk was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'm curious about what you think would look like if you hadn't joined in at a time when the company was like rebuilding. So if you joined in the middle of a product, what would your approach have been to creating the design system and all the language around it?
That is a fabulous question. I would, controversial answer, I think the outcome would have been the same. And I say that because I think one of the challenges we have when we're constructing design systems from the ground up is that oftentimes you might have a central design system team, or you might have a couple of folks who are enthusiasts who are involved in that project, and you're racing to get ahead of your design and engineering teams. I've yet to see a team who actually get ahead and maintain that lead. It's really challenging. So I think we would have always, just like we did, fell behind the curve and then had to catch up somewhere along the way. I have seen that happen in teams a lot. My advice when that does happen is to really kind of focus on what's important. And I talked a bit about the foundations. Foundations are really quick for you to put in place, and they offer a tremendous amount of value. And I think if I was to do all of this again with a new business, I would focus on getting the foundations absolutely perfect and take on a little bit of design and technical debt at the component level, just to make sure that I've got everybody on the same page about what that language is doing and which way it's pointing.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Any other questions? We've got a wee bit more time. Yes, lady over here. We'll bring you a mic.
Hello. I have a question, but maybe there's no short answer to this. So have you ever done a redesign with an established design system? And if yes, did you have any learnings you can share around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's killer, isn't it? Are you doing one at the moment? Yeah, it's not pretty. So yes, I have done that before. We actually did it at Anaplan, when the case study I used there. And because we had these foundations in place, basically we had a rebranding exercise. We were going to change all of the color palettes. We were changing some of our business goals and visions, and then down to like granular details, like we were even changing like our font. So there was a lot of things that were going to be moving. Because we'd focused on building that engineering offering and getting everybody on board with that, we actually ended up making the job much easier for ourselves than we would have done otherwise if it was a design-only system. So we were able to update all of those kind of foundational variables and then ship them out to all the teams, which sounds really kind of, sounds like a fairy tale, right? And it really wasn't. Because I think while you get 80% of the way there by doing that, you still have, and I think you will always have this massive QA lift to make sure that you haven't broken things along the way. And inevitably, you always break things. So I think the learning for me was, at the time, I sold our design system as kind of the unsung hero to our problems there, and being able to actually drive this change across the business. And it was kind of like one wheel of a car. Like, it helped us get there, but there were so many more challenges that we were going to have to face. And it's important not to undersell those, because it's still going to take work, even if you've got a great system in place.
Good. Probably time for one more, if anyone's got one more. We're okay, or?
I have a question.
Yes, gentleman over there, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your talk. It's really inspiring. So I have one question, which is, how do you see the balance between the designer freedom and using a design system? So I tend to feel that sometimes you have to compromise on the user experience and designing the optimal solution due to restraints of a design system, and maybe also limiting the possibility to optimize, micro-optimize due to that needs to fit into the design system.
Yeah, fabulous question. So I tend to think less of design systems as kind of a policing effort, with a central team that kind of guides that direction and is responsible for determining what is considered right and wrong for a business. I think instead, I think of design systems as an opportunity for a team to drive the conversation. And that kind of, for me, that realization came in later years. But what I mean by that is, it's important that a design system opens up a wealth of opportunities to allow you as the designer to make the choices that are right for you in your independent area. Now, obviously, there are rules and guidelines to follow to help make sure that your solution knits in with all those other solutions in the ecosystem. But the opportunity there is for you as an individual designer to produce something that's based on the system, but then also to offer something back, like a yes and. So when you're talking about those kind of like micro optimizations, going back with a contribution or a way that you can up level and take that design system forward. So for me, it was always a mechanism for encouraging all of our different product designers to get involved with a conversation that was outside of their squads without taking too much of their time and energy, if that makes sense. But it's a tricky balance. I think it really is. And what I often see is that when design systems start, they can be quite, I'm looking for the word now, but they can be quite controlling or quite dense. And over time, I think as people get more comfortable with the language and they learn to explore it and kind of find the edges and the boundaries, they find opportunities to push that forward and advance it. And everything seems to relax a little. But it feels like sometimes we're so uptight when we start these things because the reason we've started them is because our UX isn't kind of in line. It can be quite fragmented.
Thank you for your question. That's you done, Mark. Mark was quite happy to go first, weren't you, and just get it done. And how was that? You okay?
That was great.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. You and I need to get together with our mini dash at some point. Definitely, we do. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark is going to sadly have to go back down south, aren't you? Because you've actually got new starts and you've got work to do, haven't you?
Yes.
Well, it's been a great experience, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
See you back in Scotland. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mark.